Val is a senior public health research specialist, experienced in working across the centre's programmes to provide expertise on research and evaluation and in translating learning into action. Really key point there. Val is currently on placement with Glasgow City Council, managing a programme of work on health and inclusive growth, where she's exploring opportunities for the local authority to put health and well-being at the heart of economic decision-making in the city, and community wealth building is at the heart of that. And Val sat through the last session and listened to what Miriam had to say as well. So I'm going to hand over to Val, who's going to cover her presentation, and then we'll take questions afterwards. Val.
Thanks, Stephen. Yes, so as Stephen said, I am from a public health background. I work with the Glasgow Centre for Population Health, but I'm on secondment at the moment working with the City Region team at Glasgow City Council. So thanks very much for having me this morning. I have to confess that I'm not an economist. I've never worked in procurement. So I'm maybe a bit of an imposter, but hopefully I can add something that's useful. Okay, so can I have the next slide, please? The joint post that I'm working in is really based on Glasgow City Region's issue with inequality. It's a long-standing problem. I'm sure we're all very well aware of that, and I'm sure there are actually some regional colleagues on the call who'll know all about this. So we've got a higher than expected proportion of our population with long-term limiting illness. We have had lots of large-scale investment in the area, but it's often focused on physical regeneration and specifically on economic outcomes. So we're at the point now, I think, where we're thinking about a new approach that considers health, well-being and inequality outcomes too. Over time, I think this sort of mutually reinforcing relationship between a population in good health and well-being and a strong and inclusive economy has grown. So we're much more focused on the interconnections now, and the pandemic, I think, has really solidified that. So we really see now that people's health and the economy are not independent from each other. My little feedback loop on the slide is to indicate that. So no matter how well designed our local or regional economy might be, if we don't have a population that can participate in it, it's not going to work for us. And that report that I've got on the slide there is by the Health Foundation. I'd really recommend it. It sets out how economic development can be used to improve people's health and reduce health inequalities, which I'll say a wee bit more about next. So next slide, please. So why are we concerned about health inequality? Why does it matter? We're talking about economic development and procurement. Well, inequality is really about the differences in opportunities or outcomes that are unjust and avoidable. So difference is to be expected, that's fine, we're not all the same, but inequality is the kind of difference that's unfair and outside a person's control. And we know that economic inequality is about how we distribute economic variables, so who has what in our population or between different populations. And I think we've known for a really long time now that wealth inequality, income and wealth inequality are fundamental causes of health inequalities, and they go on to influence other factors. So poverty and inequalities in income and wealth are really important in reducing health inequalities. And I think sometimes we don't talk about this enough. Inequality is actually bad for all of us. So in more inequitable societies, all kinds of social and economic outcomes are worse than in more equitable ones. It is bad for all of us, but it's most keenly felt by those people living in the most deprived circumstances. And if you're interested in any more of that, Wilkinson and Pickett have written lots and lots and lots on this. And because we know that changing aspects of economic and social policy and practice can really have a big impact on health inequalities, that's why we're interested. Greater income and wealth, especially for the people who are least well off, will lead to better health and reduced inequality. So we're thinking more in the Glasgow City region about reframing the relationship a bit between health and the economy. Traditional economic goals still matter, of course. We need those, we need jobs, we need productivity, but we also need to be more inclusive to reach these goals. We need more people in good enough health and well-being and with the skills to access quality, well-paid employment to achieve this. So I hope there's a more balanced picture emerging that sees both economic and health outcomes as of great value. And on this slide, the picture of the report cover there is from Michael Marmot from the Marmot Review, 10 years on, which if you haven't seen that is really worth a look. So this is where community wealth building's been gaining a bit of traction, largely because the principles, which Miriam covered so beautifully this morning, address the linked economic, social and environmental challenges that we have, particularly at the moment. Okay, so next slide, please. If you were at Miriam's session, you already know all about what community wealth building is. So just to reiterate that community wealth building is an economic development approach. It's not community development, although that's likely to feature. It's about money. It's about the systems we use to generate it, who's involved in creating it, and who benefits from that wealth. It's people-centred. So a really important part of that is that it's about placing control and benefits into the hands of local people. And you might ask why we need that. Well, we might argue that the economic models that we've traditionally had leave people behind. So back to our inequality point again. And again, in Glasgow City region, we know that many people are not included in our labour market, and we want to make that more inclusive. So there's a lot of strategic level support, I would say, for community wealth building in Glasgow City region. It's written into the city as well as the city region recovery plans. We've had an inclusive growth agenda, probably like a lot of local authorities for quite a long time now. And I would say that community wealth building, for us anyway, is now viewed as the practical part of that, the practical action that supports a more inclusive economy to develop. And I'd say that's echoed at national level in Scottish Government. Okay, next slide, please. Sorry, I didn't realise I had some sort of animation going on in my slides, but there you go. So the 5 pillars, Miriam's covered these. I'm not going to go over these in any great detail. So sometimes these are called the 5 pillars of community wealth building. Sometimes they're called the values behind community wealth building. But it's broadly agreed that these 5 things matter to community wealth building. So looking specifically at the procurement pillar, progressive procurement of goods and services, this is really about asking whether some of the work we tender for could be done more by local companies. Maybe we need to break down some bigger contracts to help build those local supply chains. How can contractors help with local employment opportunities? But it's also importantly about what are the unintended consequences of buying in bulk from a big global supplier. So there's likely to be some negative overspill there, taking money out of the local or regional economy, and how can we avoid that? And community wealth building really means coordinated activity across the range of pillars. So it's a values-based system, rather than being about what sort of tweaks can we make in procurement, for example. It's broader than that. It's a framework. The buck absolutely doesn't stop with procurement, but it is a key area in community wealth building. Okay, so next slide. The enablers of community wealth building are anchor organisations, the big employers, procurers, asset owners rooted in place. So these include local authorities, also NHS boards, universities, colleges. They might also be large third sector and private sector organisations. They have an economic footprint in an area generally. So they have that economic footprint anyway. So whether they ascribe to community wealth building principles or not, they're having an economic footprint in the local or regional area. In the Glasgow City region, we have 8 member local authorities plus other partners. So the potential for us in terms of the power of the pounds we spend for social and economic gain is huge. And we've been working with the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, who Miriam mentioned, and Scottish Government, to look at where we can start building on what's already working well in the region. And CLES have come back to us with 2 reports suggesting that we focus on 2 pillars to begin with, and these are the procurement pillar and also the land and property pillar. The ownership for the recommendations that have come from CLES now sit with 2 existing regional groups that we have, and we've drawn up and agreed a response to the CLES reports with some actions in there, and I'll just touch on what was recommended that we do at a regional level. So next slide, please. CLES note the common theme that we need in terms of the procurement pillar in the region is greater consistency of approach, and they say that will benefit buyers, suppliers and communities. So it does recognise significant good practice that already exists, but we need to be better at sharing this and scaling that. So I've summarised some of the recommendations there. It's recommended that we empower and promote the role of community benefits officers. So not all of our member authorities have a community benefits officer. And that we target community benefits to local needs through community wish lists. And some member authorities are further forward with that than others. And interestingly, some are starting to think about how we generate those lists, how to engage with communities, and how do we marry up what we know about public health priorities in those areas with what the community tell us that they would like. There's also something in there about capturing and using data, so being a bit more consistent about reporting of community benefits, both for city deal that we have in the region and also business as usual contracts. CLES recommend that we do a bit more qualitative work, so not just numbers but also some stories to sit alongside that to look at the longer term impact of our progressive procurement work. They talk about using intermediaries, so supplier development programme and hubs, and looking for longer term benefits through contracts, so building apprenticeships and other employment pathways where that's possible. We need to have a better focus on planning and being prepared, and to collaborate closely with other anchor organisations and institutions. Sustainability also comes up as important. We need to push for sustainability in our contracts more. And as a result of that report from CLES with those recommendations, we were already developing a sustainable procurement strategy, but lots of those recommendations have shaped the sustainable procurement strategy and are in there, and that was actually launched yesterday, which I could share if that would be useful. On to the next slide about land. I won't go into detail on this one, but we also have a report from CLES about the land and property pillar, and that focuses on persistent vacant and derelict land, and we're writing up a strategic business case for a regional approach to tackling vacant and derelict land, working with Clyde Plan on that. So being realistic that we actually need some investment to deal with that issue. Next slide. So in terms of sort of general plans and progress across the region, part of my role is to support community wealth building to progress across the member authorities, working with Scottish Enterprise and Skills Development Scotland. I would say there really is a general commitment to the principles and some good progress, but we now need to be tapping into the potential for a better, a more coordinated approach across the anchors. So I'm focusing a bit on anchor collaboration at the moment, and we just had our first meeting of a community of practice this week. So through that we're trying to offer some peer support to practitioners who are working on delivering elements of community wealth building work. I wanted to mention the language, although the language might not be about, the language for local authorities is often about inclusive growth. The public health priority is about a sustainable, inclusive economy. There's also discussion of a wellbeing economy, and these are not exactly the same things. So why do we care about the language? Well, even if we do mean similar things, the language matters. It kind of sets a tone and attitude. is having an inclusive economy important? Are we interested in social justice? How are we framing what we're doing? So I think it's not a reason not to work together. In fact, it's a really good starting point in terms of making connections. But we do need to be careful about what our outcomes, our intended outcomes are. So I would say across the region, the procurement work tends to be the most well advanced, but it's sometimes around the margins. So we've got really good examples in around city deal work and around Commonwealth Games in the region, but it's now about bringing this into the mainstream and making closer links, crucially I think, between economic development and procurement. And later this year we'll publish a revised regional economic strategy, which is a really great opportunity, I think, to be getting some of this in at the strategic level. Okay, on to metrics, please. So how will we know when we've done any of this? Well, what we measure, I think, often comes to matter the most. So what we choose to measure is really, really important. I know that Client Manager's been building in health outcomes to economic policy, which is great. I would love to see us do some of that. We're lucky that we have the Intelligence Hub in the region, and so we're working with them on indicators of progress. But this is an area of interest across different regions, different localities, and I think we need to be linking this to national performance framework and to be discussing and sharing this so that we're collecting. We don't want to be collecting more data, we collect enough data, but we want to be looking at indicators that make sense across different areas. So the Office of the Chief Economist are interested in this, Greg have done some work, Slade too, so it would be great if we could have some commonality across how we're monitoring and measuring work towards community wealth building outcomes. And next steps, so better, more anchor collaboration I've mentioned, developing that community of practice, so we're supporting each other to deliver community wealth building work, monitoring and measurement, and then in Glasgow City region our big gap is the other three pillars. So we've started work on the two pillars that I've mentioned, but we now need to have much more of a focus on those other three to have a more strategic approach to community wealth building. And I think there's really an opportunity here post pandemic, we're still in it, but to move away from looking at economic outcomes on their own, but to try and create more inclusive economies geared towards reducing inequalities and improving health. So thinking about Wilkinson and Pickett talk about a spirit level, so where is that bubble in the spirit level? Can we shift the balance so our local and regional economies are supporting better and more equal health and wellbeing outcomes for the population, recognising if we achieve some of that, that will also help to boost the economy. So I think we do need to be brave and innovative in some of this. There are limits, of course, particularly in procurement, but finding them and maybe even pushing them in some cases is possible, and we can certainly learn from other places where this has already been done. I would say in some cases it's not about doing more, but about doing business as usual a bit differently. And when we can get some change across the pillars, including procurement, then we can start to build those sort of stronger and more inclusive economies. So I just want to finish, last slide, with a big long link, which is actually a really useful set of resources from CLES. It's a set of case studies, but it's broken down across the 5 different pillars and across different geographies, and gives some really good tangible examples of community wealth building work in practice in other areas. That's a useful starting point, I think, if you're interested in doing some more of this. So thank you, and happy to take questions.
Val, thank you for that. That was again really interesting, and I've always been a believer that health is wealth, and it's a simple statement. So, and that's emphasised with what you talked about. So, again, folks, please feel free, my lovely shy audience, to put your hands up for any questions for Val. And again, Val, there's been a number of comments and a bit of chat going on in the background while you were talking, but we are listening. I'll start off with a question for you. So, Glasgow City region, huge area, right? Significant number of partners. how have you managed to get all these different partners on board, and perhaps not just the anchor organisations, but those influential organisations? How have you managed to get your arms around them?
Well, I think the Glasgow City region is already a kind of it's an economic entity. It already exists as a thing, and so the member authorities, there are already structures there in place that bring the member authorities together. And I'm coming to this at a point where conversations about community wealth building, I would say, have already begun. It's not always called community wealth building. Sometimes it's under the guise of something else, but I would say all of the member authorities were already thinking about or doing something that you might call community wealth building. I think the difficulty in taking this forward is that issue about from the margins into the mainstream. It's really easy in a way to find examples of good work that supports a community wealth building approach in parts, but it's the kind of system change level that's really hard to get to. And across the region, yes, that's enormous. But of course, each community wealth building needs to be locally driven. So although we are trying to take an overall kind of regional approach to community wealth building, totally mindful that different local authorities will have different approaches, and we're never going to achieve, we don't want to achieve a kind of blanket approach to community wealth building across the whole region, but we do want a regional commitment to community wealth building. So yeah, I'd say that the general commitment to the principles is there. Some areas are more tangible than others, and procurement's probably one of those. You know, we know if we're doing something differently in procurement or not. So I would say, yeah, that some of that's already happening, but the difficulty will be the kind of how do we measure or describe that approach across the region. That is a difficult thing to achieve, I think.
Okay, thank you, Val. I've got a question for you that actually may be also a question to the rest of the audience, and it's from Anne McCall Smith, who isn't normally quite shy, but she's put it in the chat. And she's asking, are there links between HSCP's commissioning plans and Council's procurement strategies to ensure that health and wellbeing is integrated throughout?
There should be. Yeah, we're actually starting to work. There's a really good good sort of set of connections that are just kind of emerging there, I would say, between the NHS and economic development, and the HSCP are leading a piece of work now to go to sort of management of the NHS board and say we want to formalise this. We want to say we're doing community wealth building, and this is how we see our role in this playing out. So that's great. And there's some work going on to try to bring together plans, regional plans, and plans from the board and the HSCP in terms of spend, so that we can start looking at skills and skills gaps. So based on what Cles recommended, really see the value in looking ahead, maybe 5 years ahead, to work out where's the capital spend going to be, for example, across some of our big anchor organisations. And so when the jobs that are associated with that become available, will we be able to fill those with local people, or do we have a skills gap? So some of that's just beginning, but absolutely that should be the case, and we're trying to do that. The difficulty, I think, in that will always be, is budget. So although we can bring our plans together, or we can discuss how to work more closely together, when our funds are separate, some of those difficulties will remain. But we are trying to be better at that, at joint planning.
Thank you, Val. Val, there's been a bit of chat in the chat room about locality action plans. I don't know, are you guys integrated into the locality action plans? So people, Nick Hyde talks about locality action plans, which are effectively the wish list from a procurement point of view, developed by economic development colleagues and have been well received from suppliers and tenders. Is that something that you are involved in Glasgow?
Yes, Glasgow's doing a bit of that. Some of the other member authorities are doing that too. I think totally supportive of that. It's a really good thing. I think we need to be thinking about how, who's the community, and who are we hearing from in that community. So in terms of the community wishes, whose wishes are they? Usually the people who are sort of in greatest need might be the people that are hardest to engage. So mindful that we want to hear about what communities need, but we also need to set that alongside other information intelligence we have about different communities, and what some of the needs might be in it. I'm thinking about a public health lens there, of course, again, but I think it's part of the picture. And I would say in terms of community wealth building, community benefits are part of what procurement can do, but sort of localism and building local supply chains is also really crucial. We need to get the economic bit right, and community benefits are alongside that. So yeah, I think that there are lots of things to consider there. It's not a straightforward process, and we need to be mindful of who that community is that we're hearing from.
Okay, Val, thank you very much for that. Val, I think that's the last of the questions. If I've missed any, Val, we'll forward them on to you, and we'll post them up on your responses on the Academy. So I'm going to finish by thanking you, Val, and again, thanking our audience for attending and for their interesting comments and questions. And folks, the next session is Community Wealth Building in Practice, which runs from 11 to 11:45. And again, folks, if you can join 5-10 minutes beforehand, that would be great. And I've got a hand up just now. Sarah?
Yeah, Stephen, it's just to say we've got one more question creeped in on the chat, if there's time for it, from Mark.
Okay, thank you. Question from Mark is, do you think that it's legitimate policy for there to be a balance amongst boring old value for money for what we're buying, fair equal treatment of suppliers, and achieving progressive social value, including health, wellbeing benefit from our procurement? How do you set the balance? Thanks for that, Mark. Shy, Mark.
That's a fantastic question. That's, the nub of the whole issue, Mark. So, yes, absolutely need value for money. Super important. We can't just put that to one side and do something different. And fair, equal treatment of suppliers and achieving progressive social value, including, yes, we do need that balance, and it's really hard, but I think we need quality is the key, I think. So we need value for money, but we also need quality. So what is the quality of the contract or what's being procured? So it's back to that thing I mentioned about sort of negative overspill, unintended negative consequences. Value for money is great, but if in achieving that value for money, we are creating this whole sort of system whereby money is leaving the local and the regional economy again and again and again, well, that's not good either. That's not actually really value for money, because we're having to mop that up in a different way, and it's really all just the same big pot of money in the end. So yeah, how do we achieve that better balance? We need to have that written in. It needs to be in strategy. We need to work out what is the weighting that we give to these elements, and we need to stick to that in a business as usual situation.
Okay, Val, thank you for that last minute answer. Thank you, Val. Thanks, everyone. See you at the next session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.